Okay. Uh, Thank you, everybody. I'll be sharing a little bit about how I incorporated gender dimensions in my ongoing research, the stay-at-home paradox, urban narratives of domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm supervised by Dr. Eva Yucana and advised by my tutor, Dr. Denise Avilés. So just a really brief overview in case I haven't bored you enough in colloquiums. My main objective is to contribute to a better understanding of the increase in reporting in domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic in urban settlements, focusing mostly on the the peripheries of the city, and answering how did the peri-urban household within this context of insecurity, poverty, and inequality become the most dangerous place to be a woman during the pandemic, how the pandemic was lived differently by women, what were the factors that increased this domestic violence, and what are the protection, both formal and informal, for women and girls. And I did this following a feminist intersectional methodology, collected data, and mostly only qualitative data from March 1st to July 10th. And I focused on experts that include different sectors, government, basically everybody involved in domestic violence, but also giving and highlighting the opinions of residents living in 2 peri-urban settlements that are known for high homicide rates and also extreme socioeconomic conditions. And lastly, but very importantly, domestic violence survivors themselves. And I managed to collect over 70 interviews through phone and video, which were the only means alternative during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with this little overview, I would like to share with you how I established gender. So as I put women in the center of the research study, I of course see and establish or identify gender as a primary category of life. And I try to go beyond the normative beliefs of our biological differences and kind of focus on it as a social construction. And I think there was enough discussion yesterday about this, how we understand gender, how we perform gender. And because it is an intersectional approach, I take into consideration the diversity of social categories that can influence one woman's experiences of being born in this gendered body of a woman to the difference of another woman that probably is older or more religious or other social categories. And with this comes, with understanding gender this way, I think comes a lot of the social construction that I said, but also political and economic context play a role, as well as historical change. And with this, I've complemented with several decolonial feminists, kind of their perspectives on gender. I base myself a lot on Marcela Lagarde, Marta Lugones, recently have fallen into Central American feminist literature, Yolanda Aguilar and Femestizaje, so how we understand gender because we were colonized in this gendered body, and how we consider all this gender division in different spheres, and how this allows us to access different spheres within the peri-urban settlement. So to understand it a bit more, I would say I deepened my understanding of gender and in how it intersects with other systems of oppression. So how it intersects with racism and classism. And we see how an experience of a woman that is young could be very different from an experience that is of a woman that is older or religious or has more economic access. And how all these intersections create very diverse, unique experiences within the same kind of peri-urban context and also the same historical context. That is so much. I've been focusing on narrowing it down, and I've narrowed down kind of my analysis right now in 2 social categories that not only come up fairly often within the narratives that I collected, but also I think describe a very unique experience of living the COVID-19 pandemic as a woman and as a very religious woman, and understanding domestic violence as a religious woman, right? And all this within a very specific context, which is the peri-urban landscape. And how I integrated in the project, I would say I reflected about my own positionality, and I don't want to go deeper inside of it because Sundus mentioned it and we had a lot of discussions about it, but mostly how I knew my social categories were different from the respondents, and how it could influence not only my idea of gender, but their affect how I see their ideas of gender and feminism. And I would like to say that I had a process of deconstructing my own ideas while collecting this data as well, right? Like for me, feminism was a very specific thing. And now I've encountered that wherever there's patriarchy, there's also feminism, right? So I would say this as the first, and then letting myself be guided by the expert, but people that know, that have lived there for years, that have lived and survived and resisted domestic violence, I would say was also very important. A flexible and open questionnaire that of course allowed me to be guided by it, and that I knew what I had to answer, but also allowing the respondents to feel free to tell me what was really bothering them. Because for me, maybe it was domestic violence, but for them, no, it's the neighbors, they don't follow the measures. So we have a diversity of those narratives as well. And we could see the differences also by gender, right? About what bothered them. And another thing that I took into consideration, and this was, I think I heard it from Sundus, and your first research advice was hire a diversity in the team. And I think that really changed. We were 4, 2 women and 2 men, and other also colleagues at staff really recommended this. And this was extremely helpful, as women do respond better to women and men to men, but also we had one of the men in the team also identify as the LGBTI community member. And we had a respondent that within this very vulnerable context also identified himself within the community. And this allowed them to kind of sparkle and have a very open narrative. I think this was very important. This is something everybody can do. And especially incorporated the voice of women in extreme socioeconomic conditions, not only in the peri-urban settlement, that is already a characteristic of socioeconomic challenges, but within the settlement, to look for people that live very far away, to look for people that probably were not only oppressed by the systems of oppression we talked about, but also by not having a platform to share their experiences. So taking into consideration women that wouldn't be easily accessed through any other means. And then I would say that to capture it, some methods would include, and I think everybody has mentioned this and it's really important, to work really closely with gatekeepers in the research field. And the most important thing is about choosing the gatekeepers, I would say, because for me, it was 2 kinds of gatekeepers: the ones that led me to the narratives in the peri-urban settlements, and the ones that led me to the narratives of domestic violence survivors. Those are 2 different kind of areas. And within those, there were all leaders that coincidentally and not were women, but also knew the community, had been working for years, either within the community or with domestic violence survivors, was highly trusted people. Oh, if she recommends you, I'll tell you everything, right? So this was a very good approach. And I was extremely lucky just because this same gatekeepers needed someone to collect data, right? Needed someone to report on this. So I had, I would say, fair openings because I speak the language and I also speak the feminist narrative that they wanted to hear. And this helped me get a lot of data. And using referral sampling, like someone mentioned before, right? Getting access to the people, but we also had to take into consideration, this is an intersectional methodology. We need to, yes, take into consideration everybody that wants to talk to us and that is referred to us, but also that is different in social categories. So whenever we would ask for a recommendation, like if we were interviewing a woman, do you have a son or a cousin or someone that was different not only in gender, but in age and not only religious, but kind of taking into consideration within the referral sampling, the different categories that we were interested in really describing. And then what I'm going to see now, I just have one more. Is the gender sensitive analysis. So looking at my transcriptions and really hearing the narratives again and taking into consideration that gender lens, right? For me, it's very important. And finally, I think this was a very hard question because am I being gender sensitive consistently? I really surely hope so, because that's the point. But I do think it's really challenging, not only because of the available channels, but also accessing some state representatives was very hard because nobody wants to talk about how they're not doing anything during domestic violence, right? And first, I would say that what is challenging mostly is the available literature and information places women in this very victim position and men as the aggressors. And the literature itself kind of leads me to replicate this narrative of, oh, the women as a victim and the men as the aggressor. And it's like a very active performance where I have to say, no, there's alternatives, or no, there's women helping other women. And this is the challenge for now. And that's it. Thank you.